Hey there, and welcome back to my second episode in the series, Watercolor Basics. I'm voiceovering this one so you don't have to stare at my ugly mug. So in this episode, we are going to do some basic techniques, both wet and dry, that you're going to need to do pretty much any watercolor painting. I will go over some little extra bits here and there to help you out throughout this demonstration as they come up. And then for anyone who wants to continue on in this exercise, I do have exercises at the end that kind of function as a really nice warm-up, just to keep your skills fresh. So what you can see me doing here is just affixing a piece of watercolor paper to a piece of board. Anything that won't get damaged by water itself works pretty well. So I've used like a clipboard, a plastic clipboard. You can put it right to your kitchen table if you want to. Anything hard, flat, bigger than the paper itself that you can put tape around the edges, overlap it over the paper onto the board. It keeps the paper from warping and buckling, especially as it dries. So this paper isn't terribly high pound, so even once it gets wet, it'll still buckle. But if you leave it on the board with the tape on while it's drying, it'll dry nice and flat. And then the other benefit of having it on a board, especially one that you can pick up and move, is you can prop it up. So you can have your water come down the page with the angle of the board, which is part of what makes watercolor nice. There I just showed you my travel case of watercolor and my other travel case there. One's a Winsor & Newton and the other one's Sakura. I use those for most of my work just because it's really the highest quality paint that I have. I have tube paint as well, but it's not quite as nice of quality, so I don't tend to use that, especially if I want to do something a little bit nicer. So with that out of the way, I'm going to very sloppily pen in with Arteza brush pens. The theme of the video. Trying out my very terrible penmanship with brush pens once again. I meant to practice with those, and I'm really starting to wonder if being left-handed is kind of making it more difficult than it needs to be. Maybe I need to choke up on the brush pen a little bit more. I don't know. It's pretty sad. Anyway, what I'm going to do is draw a few boxes to do dry in one side, wet in the other side, just to go over the basics of how watercolor functions, the two main ways you can use it, and then most of the other techniques that go along with it, is a function of how wet the surface is. And so your choice of how to use the paint depends on what you want to do and achieve. And that comes down to demonstrations like this, basically practicing and figuring out how the paint is going to behave when you use it in various different situations. I can start by saying that watercolor is a transparent medium, which I used to find really annoying when I was first learning it, but it kind of is really cool because you can overlap tiles of color in interesting ways so that you can see what was already laid down. And it has like a mosaic look sometimes that also, when used correctly, you can get really, really rich color that, you would need like oil paint to do. You can't do it with acrylic. So once I finish the boxes, you will see me add some water to the travel paint set that I have, because They are dry paints. Well, you don't have to, but it helps to add a little bit of water to kind of rehydrate them a little bit. It helps the paint come out easier, and then you mix it with water in the palette. Here are the brushes I'll be using. One is a flat, the other is round, both Artist Loft brushes, I believe. Get them at Walmart, Michael's, Joann's, whatever. I actually do switch out to a considerably larger flat brush, just for that first dry brush one. So I am going to be starting with the dry technique side. That's basically just going to be anytime you're adding a wash over dry paper, or it could be over dry paint as well, but you're putting watercolor paint on top of a dry surface, and it's going to behave very, very differently than if the surface is already wet. So that's why you're differentiating between the dry and wet techniques there. The paper needs to absorb water, and so you change how the pigment soaks into the paper if you pre-wet it versus if you don't wet the paper down at all. One of the big problems with doing dry technique work is you need to really control, well, you need to control for dry and wet, but you can tend to get a lot streakier of marks if you're not careful. You can also end up with lines that dry, and you can really see like one dried area or one area and another area because of the transparency of the medium. So you might, if you're looking to get like a real smooth color, you have to, it helps to start with a really big wash, because you don't want to have to mix a new wash, because you'll never get the same color, because you're going to add water into the paint that you pull out. And as soon as you try and add more paint or more water, you're changing the consistency of that paint, and you're not going to match what you already have down on the paper. Plus, it's going to start to dry what you already have down. So all that time you spend mixing, just always make a much bigger pool of paint than you think you're going to need. And that'll go a long way to helping you do better. Here's where you can see me taking that first flat brush and realizing that it's going to be a big pain in the butt to try and use that to cover the whole 3" by 3" square, and switching out to a larger brush. So my goal for this box is just going to be to make a flat wash across the entire box. So a flat wash is basically just a single solid color, smooth all the way across, so no transitions or gradients or anything like that. One of the goals of this, if you were going to do it as an exercise, and I hope you follow along and do it too, is going to be to help build some control over the application of the paint on the surface. And you'll practice that with wet in wet as well, but yeah, you're gonna be trying to get a nice, consistent, even tone all the way across any shape, but the goal would be to keep it inside the bounds that you give it. You want to practice control over applying that color that you want to put down. And you can see I missed the lines there. But another cool thing about watercolor, while it's wet at least, you can go ahead and erase to a certain degree. Take a nice, like, clean, wet brush and go over the area where you don't want that paint that you laid down. And just kind of re-wet it a little bit, wipe it up with a paper towel, and it's like it never happened. Except it did happen, because it was on video. You didn't see that. Here you're going to see me get a little bit more of that Prussian blue straight out of the paint well, so I can get a nice thick consistency out of it. And then I'm using it to just dry brush, like straight onto the paper. We're going for a texture kind of style here, a technique to give you textures that you kind of use the texture of the paper itself, and then depending on how much paint you have on the brush, how thick it is, and kind of how you hold it to the paper. So especially if you get it like right on its side and get the belly of the brush just skimming across the top of the paper, you can end up with a really cool kind of organic texture that it can be really helpful in a lot of situations when you're painting things where you can't paint every little detail, but you want to try and get a texture down that can help sell something, basically. Moving right along, we're going to do the wet in wet side. So as the name would suggest, the paper needs to be wet. Go figure. So I am just putting not a lot of water on the paper, but enough to get it nice and wet, juicy. So there is a difference between, say, wet and damp. I am shooting for wet here, but the difference really is once a wet area starts to dry, but it's not all the way dry, but it's really not still wet, there is a difference there. And the more you work with watercolor, the more you'll pick up on that moisture level in the paper and get a better feel for how it's going to affect what paint you're putting on the surface. So that's really the entire goal, especially of doing exercises, but in general, the more experience you get with it, you end up getting a feel for how the paint is going to respond. Going into that Prussian blue one more time. Such a pretty blue. So it's a lot easier to add the paint to a wet in wet wash, just because you don't have to worry about streaking quite so much, because the surface is already wet. As it dries, and well, you can move it around within that wet area, for one, and two, as it dries, it's going to even further kind of pull those pigments around in somewhat of a homogeneous way. Also, if you are doing some sort of a drawing or painting and you want to, say, pre-wet an area where you want paint, but you don't want paint outside of that area, wet and wet can be really helpful, because you can just wet an area and the paint will want to stay in the wet area. It's not going to leave a wet spot to go to dry paper. I did let this dry all the way, mostly because I had to go away from the painting and do something, but it gives me a cool opportunity to demonstrate layering. So by now this would basically be dry on dry. The goal again for this square and the one beside it is just getting a nice even wash of the second color. I believe that is crimson red, and putting it over the top of the other one, and that is the cool thing about watercolor, right? You're putting bright red, not bright red, but you're putting red on top of another color, in this case blue, and it turns a really cool purple, which makes sense if you get your color theory. But so you can mix different colors in different ways. You can layer a solid color over another solid color, or you could mix the two on the palette, but you do get different looking purples each way you do it. So you can really play around with that technique and figure out, you know, which ones you like, and of the paints you have, how they work best to get different colors. And that can be a whole different, you know, color theory video, but doing exercises like this is going to help you get a feel for what you like and what your paints are capable of and how they interact with the paper. All of it interacts together in sometimes such a chaotic way that a lot of people do say that, you know, the water has a mind of its own, and so you can have an idea and you can have a skill in mind, and there's still the chance of it that's left up to water, and that kind of makes it so there's sort of another artist doing it with you there. We're going to move on to the last square there on the right and do a graded wash. So I'm going to start with one color and then slowly add another color to it. And what it should do is create a nice smooth gradient change from the one color to the other color. But first, the salt. I just sprinkle a little salt. That is pink Himalayan salt, but I think you can use any kind you want. Just at the bottom, while the one was still wet, to demonstrate a technique I find a little bit silly myself, but everyone talks about it. So I will too. You'll see what happens in the end. But back to the graded wash. I switched over to that cute little travel paintbrush because I needed a smaller one, and that's my pointiest little brush. Just happens to be a cool little collapsible one. So I'm making a nice wash there, relatively wet because I need a fair bit of water to do what I'm trying to do here. But what you want to do is try and create a painted area there and have it be wet enough that there's essentially a bead of water running all along the bottom. And this is where having that board tilted helps as well, because you're going to keep refilling the brush with more paint and basically adding water that's in the brush to that bead and pulling it down a little bit further each time. And what that kind of does is it keeps an active area of paint where it's still mixing, it's not drying, but it's also not running away from you and falling all down the page. But in the end, it serves to make it so that the area stays workable and helps you keep it a nice smooth. You can keep it the same by not changing what you're doing, not changing that wash, and end up with a nice flat wash. Or you can do this where I keep adding a little bit more of the blue wash each time. So essentially that little bead started out nice crimson red, and then I just kept adding a little bit more blue each time I pulled it down, till by the bottom it pretty much looks completely blue. Not a perfect transition, I admit. So after failing to try and correct what I saw as errors in the graded wash, I moved on to that boring square on the left. Because to me, those colors reminded me of a nice sunset sky color. So I decided to see if I could push that a little bit more and kind of demonstrate a little bit more of what you can do with kind of the techniques we've already played with here. So I went back to that square, I lifted out color where I where I set down the brush, a wet brush, and let it kind of soak back into the paint a little bit. Careful not to add too much water back into the paper, or it can run and then pull pigment and it dries in these funny crinkly patterns. It's really awful. Especially when you don't mean for it to happen. It just kind of creeps up on you. But the cool thing here is after lifting out, it seems to have mostly lifted just the top layer, that red, off. So it's still very, very blue underneath, which in contrast is a lot lighter. So you kind of end up with a very large value difference, which to me looks a little bit like water. I do a little bit more lifting out in the sky, and then into the empty areas I'll add in some other colors, but I'll go ahead and fast forward through this so you don't have to listen to me ramble constantly. As soon as this is over, I have one little exercise to show you that works great for both practicing these skills as well as warming up before you want to do some sort of a painting. You basically just draw out a bunch of shapes, whatever you want, random, regular shapes, irregular shapes, and then just fill it in with all the different types of techniques that you have learned. So wet and wet, dry, add color into wet, let it bleed around, and it can be really goofy, and I don't know if I would necessarily have shown this to anyone, but it's fun to practice and play with and see how you can use the paint to come up with ways to show form and value in different ways. And thanks for watching, and check out part 3 for a follow-along tutorial. And now, a word from our sponsor.